what I've experienced in Spain, visiting many schools, secondary schools, for example, where English is taught principally through explanation. Well, I'm pleased to say that things are moving on. What are we up to? 6. Alistair, off you go.
The key to language learning is well-planned and lively drill, drill, drill.
Not even lively drill. I like that little waver. Well-planned and lively. So, yeah, I mean, and I've had people who have contested this in previous ways to say, well, no, there is an element. Of course there's an element of repetition in any language learning, any kind of practice of any skill. But of course, again, we don't know the date, but we're presumably associating it with behavior as an audiolingual approach that only drilling is going to have its limitations. It's not to say that some drilling, of course, is not appropriate, maybe for reasons that are different than we originally thought. I think, personally, drilling, if anything, raises students' awareness, not that it makes them memorize the language necessarily, but it draws things to the focus of attention. But if you write something on the board, students are more likely to write it down and take it seriously. Similarly, if you get students to repeat something, it's more likely to stand out from all the other noise in the lesson. So I think there is a case for every now and then, as it were, sort of highlighting something by a quick drill. But I don't think it reaches those parts of learning that other more personalized activities or more creative activities reach. How are we going?
7.
Anne.
We teach grammar through conversation and not, as some school teachers attempt, conversation through grammar.
A deathly hush fell upon the room. Well, again, if you buy into that kind of experiential learning, then this is very much, you should, I mean, the sentiment, although it was expressed in 1953, and of course what they called conversation in 1953 in the classroom was in fact rather rigid routines, teacher-led routines, in which the students just simply answered questions, and that was called conversation. But nevertheless, this was, of course, a key tenet of the direct method approach. You don't talk about the grammar, you simply engage in language use, and the grammar will take care of itself by analogy with first language acquisition. This is from Toil and Chat, incidentally. So I don't know what the toil part of it was, but this is definitely the chat part. Yeah, so I would give that the thumbs up, if only because it moves pedagogy away from just endless grammar explanations. And we have
Number 8. The language must not be allowed to stay imprisoned between the pages of a book.
Yay! Beautifully read, too. And number 9, Stephen.
Nothing should be spoken before it has been heard. Nothing should be read before it has been spoken. Nothing should be written before it has been read.
Just think. I've had audiences that have taken a while to process this. They thought it was a kind of Zen koan or something. But when you think about it, it's the same sort of principle. That's all about imitation, correct model. So it's, in a sense, trying to avoid learners ever making errors. And so it's very much, when I was first trained, not long after, in fact, well, the first course book I ever used was this book, First Things First. This was a kind of mantra that was intoned during your training courses, that this is the sequence that you should work through. And it has a certain logic. I'm not saying it's entirely foolish, but the idea that learners should be frog-marched down a very, very narrow set of choices, and that speaking should come at the very end of those choices, does seem to fly in the face of kind of common sense. So we'll give that one a blue question mark. And we have one more, I think, from Bob.
Yes.
Off you go, Bob.
The students should feel that each lesson is their lesson, not the teacher's. In an English class which is well run, the teacher is only a guide.
Yeah, I thought I'd have a nice one to end up on. And again, this is a lovely book, 1949, The Teaching of English, a Manual for Teachers. So I think you can see, in fact, actually the bulk of these statements represent good common sense. And there was that kind of aberration that happened in the 50s and 60s with the onset of the audiolingualism. Even then, I'd add a proviso that there's still some good sense to be gained from people like Louis Alexander. I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that everything these people said was questionable. But I think what this does do is it reminds us yet again that, in a sense, the view that we have of methodology as being a sort of an upward movement from darkness into the light as we've progressed through a century of language teaching, not to mention the 20 centuries before that. But this is very much how the history of methods is often portrayed on training courses, and I'm as guilty as anybody. It's the sense that we started in the darkness, with grammar translation, but it's been a steady progress into light. And as if the analogy, in a sense, is like the theory of evolution. It's the kind of evolutionary progression from, one-celled creatures right through to man at the top reading the newspaper. As if you mapped onto that some of the great figures in the history of ELT in the last 100 years, you'd get something like that. So, in the beginning was Berlitz on the right, and then he begat Harold Palmer here on the left. But then along came Skinner, who was smote by Chomsky, and then, of course, at the top of the evolutionary tree, we have Henry Widdowson representing the communicative approach. And that's, in a sense, this is facetious, but it's how often the history of methods is presented. As I say, when, in fact, if you look back at some of these books, as we've been doing, we see that a lot of this common sense is not method-specific, and it has been around a lot longer than any specific method. So it may be better to think of the history of methodology not so much as an evolutionary progression, but as the recycling of a number of basic core principles, different configurations, if you like, of some basic principles. And this was expressed some time ago, 1989, by Alistair Pennycook in an article that he wrote, which was in that period when people were celebrating the death of methods, if you like, when he said that these changes, methodological changes over time, have represented different configurations of the same basic options. And what I would like to look at now is what some of these basic options are. So this is the slightly theoretical bit. I'm sorry, Spain, I know it's Saturday morning, but, a little bit of theory. It's only going to be 5 minutes worth. But I am interested in fact, this grew out of the invitation to write a chapter for a book, a handbook, an applied linguistics handbook at university level, and I was asked to do something on language teaching methodology. So, what can I say about methodology that's going to be different from what everybody else has been saying, this kind of progression? There was grammar translation. And so this was the challenge, to try and sort of write about methodology, but not write about it in terms of this sort of chronological sequence, but to look at what are these basic principles and how are they being configured. And to do that, I use a kind of rubric. Well, I use two things. First of all, H.H. Stern, in a book that came out in 1983, I think, The Fundamentals of Language Teaching, did a similar thing, where he took 3 parameters, or what he called dimensions, which in a sense defined methods. And I've just simply extended the number of dimensions. And I've mapped that onto a rubric that I got from Jack Richards and Dick Schmidt's Dictionary of Applied Linguistics, the Longman one, and their definition of method, the 6 different kind of factors that help define methods. And the first of these is the nature of language. Where do you position yourself, or where does the teacher, or where does the methodologist, or where does the course book writer or the syllabus designer position him or herself on that cline, or that polarity, if you like, between form and function? And the history of syllabuses and course designs goes way back, and the history of applied linguistics, in a sense, this fluctuation between a concern with form or formal descriptions of the language and functional or semantic descriptions of the language. And so, of course, we had a long period where, in a sense, we haven't really emerged from. If you look at the contents page of any course book now, you'll see the same headings for the chapters as there were 40, 50 years ago. In other words, I'm not saying in every case, but in many cases, the progression is defined in terms of particular linguistic structures. So Unit 1, present simple. Unit 2, present continuous. Unit 3, present, and so on and so on and so on. And of course, we know, those of you who are old enough will remember the heady days of the communicative approach when all this was thrown out the window and a functional description was introduced. And so we had course book units on asking the way, or course book units on complaining, or course book units on narrating, etc. That lasted approximately 10 years before everything was all changed again and went back to structural descriptions. I'm talking about general English courses, not English for specific purposes, which is both earlier than and later has managed to keep a focus on either topics or semantic areas or genres or whatever. But that sort of that fluctuation has characterized a lot of, as I say, a lot of methodology, not to say applied linguistics, and not to say that form doesn't imply function, or that form is always divorced from function, or vice versa. But where, if your starting point is form, the danger is that you may become overly concerned with form at the expense of meaning, and likewise, the contrary applies. And this was one of the problems with the functional approach, that people were learning functions, but they weren't learning any generative grammar. So, anyway, that's the nature. That's one parameter. The second one is how you define the nature of learning. So on the one hand, language, on the other hand, learning. And a kind of polarity there is between an analytic approach as opposed to an experiential one. We've seen some examples in those course books of experiential statements of experiential learning, that you can learn grammar through simply using the language, or that you can learn speaking through speaking, or reading through reading, as opposed to breaking it all down and teaching it incrementally. Then there are the goals of second language learning. Are these defined in terms of accuracy, or are they defined in terms of communication? And I'm not suggesting, again, that these are mutually exclusive, but very much the fluctuations in the last 20, 30 years have been around this. What do we prioritize in terms of what the goals of second language learning are? Are they accuracy, precision, correctness, target-like, or are they simply communication, fluency, getting your meaning across? Then the type of, related to that, the type of syllabus, at least two dimensions here, if you like, between a syllabus which focuses primarily on systems, that is, grammar, phonology, lexis, discourse, or whatever, or a type of syllabus which focuses more on skills, reading, speaking, writing, listening, and all the sub-skills associated with those. Likewise, the choice between a segregated syllabus or an integrated one. A segregated syllabus where English, if that is the target language, is taught as a separate subject, irrespective of what's going on in the rest of the curriculum, or an integrated syllabus where English is taught as the medium. English is the medium for teaching other subjects like geography or math or social studies or nature study or whatever. And of course, it's the integrated syllabus or curriculum is becoming very popular now, particularly in Europe, in the shape of content and language integrated learning. Is that the acronym for CLIL? Has that reached Japan yet? It's the idea of you teach, particularly at primary level, you teach the subject through English, and so the students, learners, get the benefit of both. That would be an integrated syllabus. Then the role of the teachers, the learners, the materials, these choices. Is it very cognitive in terms of the approach, or where everything is intellectualized, or, again, not mutually exclusive, but is there more emphasis on the whole person in terms of the learner, taking into account their emotions, their experiences, their affect, as it were. And of course, we saw during the 60s and 70s this exponential growth in so-called humanistic approaches. I hear an echo. Where the emphasis was much more on the emphasis has shifted away from an overly cognitive view to a more effective one. And then transmissive teaching, a bit like I'm doing now, versus dialogic, which we'll be doing later, where we interact more on more symmetrical, less hierarchical relationship. That, again, has defined very much. We saw that in those pictures of teachers in their very transmissive style roles. The teaching procedures, whether the approach is deductive or inductive. Deductive meaning I'll give you the rules and then we'll practice them. Inductive, you work out the rules through discovery. And whether the teaching procedures allow for the use of the learner's L1 or are purely monolingual, using only the target language. That's been a very defined